Well, good to be with everybody here today. This is Dr. J. Smith, and this is a special live stream for me because this is the first time I've had on board Robert Spencer. Robert Spencer, I don't think too many of you need to know or are not aware of who he is. He's written many books. He is responsible for Jihad Watch. Most of us who are engaging with Islam publicly have used his material, have been very dependent on not only his angle of performance, but also his expertise on it and his knowledge and gleaning, going back to the sources for much of what he says. So it's been a great privilege to have Robert Spencer on board with us today. And we're going to be looking at Muhammad specifically. On Fander Films, we've been going through all the historical problems or difficulties with 7th century Islam, and particularly zoning in on where is this Islam? Where is a man named Muhammad? Where is a place called Mecca? Where are these people called Muslims, or this religion called Islam? And also, where is this book called the Quran? Those are the 5 areas we're zoning in on. And at this point, we're now looking at Muhammad. And Robert Spencer wrote in 2012 this book here. Robert, it's good to have you here. Thanks for coming on board.
Thank you. Great to be here. An honor, actually.
This is your book, right?
That is my book, Guilty as Charged.
And you still take credit for it, correct?
Oh, yes, absolutely. 100%. Even more than I did when I wrote it. I'm certain that what it's saying is reliable.
Okay, so we're not gonna have you backpedal and suddenly reject everything you've done in the past. So you still hold firm to that.
That's right, every bit of it.
Now, give me some background. So a lot of people here don't know you that well. Others who are coming in from other parts of the world do know you, but would like to know, what is it? Give us a background of who you are, where you come from, and why specifically are you engaging with Islam? What sparked your interest in Islam?
Yeah, well, my family is from the Islamic world. My grandparents were born in Çeşme, which is a city on the Aegean Sea in Asia Minor, in what is now Turkey. They were born in the Ottoman Empire, and they were around 1916 given the choice of conversion to Islam or exile. And they chose exile, came to the United States, lived in New York. I knew them when I was very young and would ask them about life over there, and they would tell me how beautiful the city was, how wonderful it was to grow up there. As a matter of fact, my grandmother and Barack Obama are 2 people I know who say that the Islamic call to prayer is the most beautiful sound in the world. But that did not prevent their exile. And then when I would ask them why they were exiled, they would not or could not tell me. And so ultimately, this fired in me a great curiosity, which led me to try to find out for myself. And what I found out led me directly into the study of Islam, the teachings of Islam, particularly in regard to the status of non-Muslims in Islamic society, Sharia society, and the warfare against non-Muslims that is mandated in the Quran and so on.
Okay, so you have had this background, you've had this interest, you've gleaned into it, but you've really moved into a much more polemical view of understanding. You've really gone on the offense. Why polemic? Why have you gone into this area of Islam?
Well, I don't really think of what I do as polemical. I suppose it is, but I just am telling the truth.
Robert, you are polemical, believe me. The fact that you're not permitted to go to Britain, the fact that you're shut down whenever you try to get into a public building, the fact that you are seen as I went up on Wikipedia, and this is how they described you, that you're an American anti-Muslim and Islamophobe. These are the titles that follow you everywhere you go.
Wikipedia.
Go ahead, explain that.
Wikipedia is a site with a very particular perspective, and it's not, I would say, remotely fair or accurate. Nothing that I have done is anti-Muslim. Anti-Muslim suggests that I'm against a group of people, and actually, as many people have observed, it is many Muslims who are victims of Islam, who suffer under the strictures of Islamic law, many women who have been oppressed, brutalized, even killed because of the teachings of the Quran regarding wife beating and the directives of the Hadith in that regard. And I am speaking for them, actually. Whenever women's, what is it called? World Hijab Day. Whenever World Hijab Day comes around every year, I publish a list on Jihad Watch of women that I know of, and of course it's only a tiny fraction, but women that I know of who have been subjected to violence, at very least threats, some of them killed, for not wearing the hijab, and asking who's speaking for them.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to, at very least, speak for them and for others who suffer because of Sharia provisions. It's not anti-Muslim to do that any more than to oppose Nazism would be anti-German. There were obviously Germans who hated the Nazis and fought against what they did, and there are obviously Muslims who would much rather live in the West away from Sharia without trying to bring Sharia here. Which is not to say that there aren't other Muslims who are trying to bring Sharia here. But what I see that I'm doing is, or what I'm trying to do is simply to tell truths that are not being told, that are being obscured, deliberately obfuscated by publications such as Wikipedia, and to substantiate the reality, the accuracy of what I'm saying by reference to the Islamic texts or whatever relevant source. I don't think that's polemical, but I think it's a necessary action in regard to trying to correct the record and to tell the truth about some things where lies are prevailing. The idea of Islamophobia is a propaganda neologism. It doesn't really mean anything except somebody who says things about Islam that people don't like. There are many, many Islamic scholars who say exactly the same things that I do, many ex-Muslim Islamic scholars, many people who know far more about Islam than I do, and they say the same things that I do, and nobody calls them Islamophobic. To use this charge to levy this charge is simply a tool for those who want to enable jihad violence and Sharia oppression for whatever reason, whatever variety of reasons. It's a tool for them in order to try to discredit and silence and marginalize and silence the people who are speaking the truths they would rather obscure.
Okay, so it's a tag that people put on you to try to shut you up and try to embarrass you. Now, you always come back and you say, I'm the good kind of Islamophobe, and that's what you're talking about. You're this, if you want to take that title, you're a good Islamophobe.
Yeah, by that I mean that this is not something, I have to say, I don't always say that. That was something that I did in 2017 when I wrote a book called Confessions of an Islamophobe, which is an attempt to address a lot of the criticisms that I've received, as well as to explain my positions on things. And in that I say, look, Islamic law, it's not that I made it up, but you well know, and anybody who studies these things well knows, that Islamic law, Sharia, in its classic formulations, teaches warfare against and the subjugation of unbelievers, teaches the oppression of women, teaches hatred of Jews and other non-Muslims, teaches all kinds of things that are bad for human beings, Muslim and non-Muslim.
Yeah.
And if opposing those things makes one an Islamophobe, then I am.
Okay.
But I think any decent human being in that case ought to be an Islamophobe.
Probably even better is now we're going to move into this book here. This would be a probably even better example of what we should be doing, and that is what you did in this book here. Did Muhammad exist? And I assume that when you started this book, this niggling problem came up here because you did write this book here, The Truth About Muhammad, which is an earlier book written in 2007. Am I correct?
Yeah, 2006. And actually, a lot of people say, how could you possibly have done this? You contradicted yourself. In reality, if you read The Truth About Muhammad, what I say in there is that the historical value of the texts regarding Muhammad is an open question. And it's very likely that a lot of this has no historical value whatsoever. But Muslims believe that this is what Muhammad said and did, and non-Muslims need to know that. So The Truth About Muhammad explains what Muslims believe, and then the Did Muhammad Exist book explains the historical value or lack thereof of those teachings about Muhammad. So
okay.
There's no contradiction between the two.
And that is a question that has come up, and I'm glad you answered that very quickly. So you've jumped the gun on me on that one. But let's go ahead and look at these two books, because this one starts from the premise that we need to engage with the Islamic traditions. Explain for an awful lot of people out there why that is important. What is wrong with the Islamic tradition? Exactly what do you mean about and if you could just define what you're referring to, and then if you could zero in on why then you then had to move back away from the 9th and 10th century back to the 7th century. What was the reason then you had to then come up with this book? And if it help people who are out there, especially those who are not inaugurated to what you're referring to.
Well, yeah. In the first place, the sources of Muhammad, what we know about Muhammad, comes from not the Quran. Muhammad is only mentioned by name 4 times in the Quran, and there's nothing in any of those references that gives us any information about who he was or what he was like or what he taught or anything at all. And so it's even a matter of question whether those texts refer to the person who is considered the prophet of Islam now at all. Now, if you want to find out what Muslims believe about Muhammad, you have to go to the Sirah literature and the Hadith. The Sirah, which obviously is a word that means biography, comes from the 8th century, the early part of the 8th century, at least 80 years, and probably more after Muhammad is supposed to have died. The first biography of Muhammad appears, the Sirat Rasulullah by Ibn Ishaq. But we don't even have a copy of that. We have extensive extracts of it by Ibn Hisham, another writer, who reproduced a great deal of it even later in the 9th century. Also in the 9th century, we have Bukhari and Muslim, as well as the other Hadith collectors, beginning to gather traditions about Muhammad's words and deeds. Now, the Hadith and the Sirah literature, when it's considered authentic by Islamic scholars, forms the basis for Islamic law and also forms the basis for the biography of Muhammad that you would get if you walked into a mosque today and asked them to tell you about Muhammad. You would get a potted biography that's based on various extracts from the Sirah and Hadith. The problem, however, is that there's no trace of this material from before the early part of the 8th century, and most of it comes from the 9th. So you're talking about 100 to 200 years after Muhammad lived. It's as if the first biography of Theodore Roosevelt was just coming out today, and nothing had been spoken about him before that, except the most cursory and elliptical of references. And so that leads one inevitably to the question of how much of this has historical value at all. So the truth about Muhammad explains what Muslims believe about what Muhammad said and did, and then the did Muhammad exist is an evaluation of whether those traditions can really be or should really be taken as historical accounts.
Right. One of the claims. So you have, because of the fact that all of these are so much later, you're talking about Ibn Ishaq 765 when he died. You're talking about Ibn Hisham 833 when he died. You're talking about al-Bukhari 870, Sahih Muslim 875. You're talking about al-Tabari 923. So you're talking about, and as you just admitted, we don't even have Ibn Ishaq's. It's only what Ibn Hisham has chosen to leave behind, who has chosen to retain and compile. That's all we have redacted back to Ibn Ishaq. So we're talking about 9th and 10th century for that which is happening in the 7th century. In this book, then, you go back to the 7th century because you're bothered by that, is what you're saying. You're bothered by the fact that everything is dependent on really oral tradition, aren't we? Because we're talking about 200 to 300 years of oral tradition. Yeah. So you've gone back. And yeah. What is it? Just kind of, before we get in, unpack it a bit, what have you found in the 7th century? Or what have you not found?
I find a gaping absence. I find an extraordinary silence that has, to my knowledge, never been adequately addressed by Muslim or non-Muslim scholars of the early period of Islam. And that is specifically from the 630s, from 632, when Muhammad is supposed to have died, until the 690s, a period of 60 years. There are only a couple of scattered mentions, a few scattered mentions of the name Muhammad, with no information that corresponds to anything that we know about the Prophet of Islam today in them. And there is nothing, no mention of the Hadith literature, no indication that it existed as this large body of oral tradition, which it would have had to if it was really about Muhammad, who died in 632. And obviously in the 650s, 660s, 670s, 680s, it must have existed. But there's no indication that it did, no reference to it anywhere. And most tellingly of all, you find in particular in the writings of Sophronius of Jerusalem, who was the patriarch of Jerusalem in 637 when the Arab armies came in, and in the writings of other non-Muslims who were chronicling the conquest of their own homeland by the Arab invaders. They give no indication that they are aware that the invaders have a new religion, a new prophet, or a new holy book. And I think that's extraordinary, especially in the case of Sophronius, because Sophronius goes into great detail about who these people are and what they believe. And nowhere does he give does he mention the word Muslim or the name Muhammad or the Quran. He doesn't show any awareness that the invaders have mentioned those things or referenced them or carrying them around or any kind of indication that they are the adherents of a new religion. That doesn't come until later.
Robert, let's go one by one real quickly. The Doctrine of Jacobi 634 does refer to a prophet.
Yes.
So it says this prophet is living in 634 and that he's going up to Jerusalem. I mean, there are two problems right there, and that he has keys to paradise, which is a problem as well, and that he's talking about the anointed one yet to come, who's coming out.
I think that's the biggest problem there. Excuse me, I lost the picture. Just a second. Are you still there?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
Yeah, you're fine.
I guess I have to keep hitting the mouse, or I'm going to lose the picture here.
Your screen may go out on you. Mine does the same thing. Sometimes you have to to wake them up to let them know you're still alive.
There we go. The most significant part of the Doctrine of Jacobi, as far as I'm concerned, is that it says that he's talking about the anointed one who is to come, because that's exactly what Muhammad, according to the traditional story, did not do.
Yeah, he was. Yeah.
Exactly. He's the seal of the prophets, according to...
How could there be someone after him? Yeah.
The Muslims to this day get very upset at any sect that suggests that anybody came after him. So
okay,
those who glibly invoke the Doctrine of Jacobi as indication that Muhammad is a historical personage conveniently gloss over the fact that there are very serious divergences between what it says and what the Islamic sources tell us about Muhammad. Notably also the fact that he died in 632 and the Doctrine of Jacobi has him alive and invading Syria, which the Islamic sources say he never did, after he's supposed to have died.
Well, let me just pick up on that. You do have these two coins that we have: a Palestinian coin from 647 that has Muhammad written on it, and a Syrian coin in 687 that has also Muhammad written on it. So the coins seem to suggest there is someone named Muhammad. The difficulty, of course, is that both those coins also have this Muhammad holding a cross and has a cross on his crown. I mean, explain that Muhammad to me, because there is the name Muhammad there, but it's not a Islamic Muhammad. It looks like a Christian Muhammad.
Yeah, and we have to remember that the name Muhammad never existed before the Prophet of Islam as a name. It can be construed as a title, a participle phrase in Arabic, the one who is being praised or the praised one, and consequently, it's not a slam dunk that when the coins say Muhammad, it refers to the Prophet of Islam. Also, the presence of the cross on there is extraordinary, because if we are to believe the mainstream narrative, then Muhammad taught that Jesus is going to come back and break the crosses, that the cross is an affront. The Quran says that they did not kill or crucify him, but it appeared so unto them in chapter 4, verse 157. And so here you have Muhammad preaching explicitly and repeatedly against the cross. And we're supposed to believe that within a few decades of his death, his followers are putting his name on coins along with the detested symbol that he rejected and told his followers to reject. It doesn't make any sense. But it does make sense if you posit instead that the word Muhammad is referring to someone else and is a title either for the ruler or perhaps for Jesus himself as being the one who is praised.
So you're implying there is a man, there is someone who's leading people, the Arabs. He is, in the case of the Dr. Jacobi, he has gone and he has defeated the Byzantines there in Jerusalem. So there is someone who is doing this, but this is not, this name Muhammad is something that's attributed at a later time then?
Well, there is, you have the very early reference to the Tayyeh of Muhammad, which comes from, I believe, I'm going from memory here, the 640s. And
yes,
so
640s is what you have in your book.
Yeah. Excuse me. So you do have the word, the name, or the title Muhammad floating around. It's even possible, as I say in the book, that there may have been a figure, an individual named Muhammad, maybe even somebody who did lead armies against the Byzantines. But you don't have any indication that there was anybody named Muhammad who was the person who does all these things in the Hadith. There's no trace of that, no record of that, no sign of the Prophet of Islam. So there may have been a Muhammad upon whom all this legendary material was hung, all put on him like a clothes on a frame, but no indication that the Arab invaders, I should say actually, the Arab conquests are abundantly attested. They certainly happened. There is Muslim and
Let's give a date to that, Robert. What are the dates for the Arab conquests?
Starting in the 630s, you have the conquest of Egypt, of Syria, of Jerusalem, of Persia, of India, and is ultimately all across North Africa to Spain. And in every case, you have the non-Muslims speaking about, writing about what happened. But nowhere until the 690s do you have them giving any indication that there's a new prophet, a new holy book, or a new religion involved. And
I'm going to run back to the coins again with Muawiyah. Here is a caliph. He comes into power in 661. He's in power from 661 up until 680, so roughly 20 years. Seen and known, as certainly from the Islamic traditions, as the first of the Umayyad caliphs. And he is the one that mints coins. And when he mints the coins, he puts the images not of himself, but of Khosrau, the Sasanian, which is interesting. And on the back side of the coins, he has these fire altars. But on the fringes, along the fringes, he has Bismillah. Bismillah. Can you explain that? Would that not suggest that this is Islam? Bismillah. Praise be unto Allah.
Well, it does exactly the opposite. If you've got the fire altars and there are other coins that Muawiyah, actually it's not the coins with Muawiyah, it's some of the inscriptions on buildings that were constructed during his reign. You've got crosses on the inscriptions next to his name. And that is much the same as the fire altars on the coins. That it's clear that Muawiyah was a syncretistic ruler who was trying to unify his new empire by appealing to all the various religions, the Zoroastrians who worship fire, and the Christians and others, by giving elements of all of their religions in various presentations. And so the Bismillah only is testimony to the fact that the word Allah, the name Allah, existed before Islam, as also is witnessed the fact that the Arabic-speaking Christians and Jews have used the word Allah for God, for the God of the Bible, but no indication in that alone that they're referring to Islam. There is, in other words, to back up the Bismillah, there's nothing else of Islamic character that we see in the reign of Muawiyah or Yazid, for that matter, after him. There's nothing specifically Islamic about what they say or do. If you say, well, the Bismillah is itself specifically Islamic, I don't think that that's accurate. But even if it were, that's the only thing you've got. And it's nothing like the huge elaboration of material about Muhammad that we get in the 8th and 9th centuries.
Okay, well, there is one coined by Muawiyah where there is a star and a crescent on all four sides. Would that not suggest that this is Islamic? Because that's the symbol they use today.
I think that it suggests here again that the symbol predates the religion. It's just like the recent discovery that I hope to do a revised edition of Did Muhammad Exist and put this in. But you may recall the last couple of years there was a discovery of some manuscripts of the Quran. And originally there was great rejoicing among Muslims because the Qurans, these manuscripts were dated very early in the early part of the 7th century. And people were taking that as confirmation that they were written actually at the time of Muhammad during his lifetime. But then as more details came out, it became clear that the manuscripts actually predate Islam, that these Quranic manuscripts come from the latter part of the 6th century, before there was any Islam. And so they only testify to the fact that various existing materials were taken and added into the Quran to create the Islamic holy book. And in the same way, the Bismillah, the star, and the crescent were incorporated into Islam, but they predated.
Robert, you're referring to the Birmingham Folios, which are really only 2 pieces of paper. They're only a side and the back of 2 pages that looks like they come from the Petropolitanus manuscript that is that François de Roche holds in Paris. What's fascinating, and you're getting into this carbon dating, we'll be doing another show. I've asked the permission if I could do another show just on the Quran and on the stages of the Quran. I'm not going to do it in this hour because we don't have time to do that. But that will be another one, a follow-up on just looking and seeing what we now know of the manuscripts. But in that, you do bring up the problem with radiocarbon dating, and you did. We do know that there have been radiocarbon datings of the Sana'a manuscript that go right back from 390 up to 500, which predates Islam, predates Muhammad, predates the Quran. It predates everything. So radiocarbon dating can be problematic in the best of times. But coming back to Muhammad himself. So we do have the coins, which suggests that Muawiyah and the others that, because they're, once Muawiyah comes to power, you start getting a proliferation of coins. And they do not show, as you have rightly said, they do not show an Islamic Muhammad or an Islamic adherence. It looks like it's a polyglot. On the East, it's all Zoroastrian. In the Western coins, they tend to be more Christian. Once you look at that and you compare that with what we now are seeing with the Qiblas that are coming out from Dan Gibson's research, all the Qiblas are pointing to Petra up until 706. We don't find anything towards somewhere called Mecca until 727 is the first mosque that we see towards Mecca. When you look at all of the geographical locations in the Quran itself, 65 locations, and not any of them fit Mecca. They all fit much further north. This man, Muhammad, then, looking at all this other evidence, and this is evidence that we can look at. This is not an absence of evidence. This is real evidence that we're now looking at from the 7th century. This is not the traditions that are redacting it back to from the 9th and 10th century back to the 7th century. These are actually material that we can look at today. They do exist. We can touch them. We can feel them. We can see them. We can actually be there and be in their presence. This kind of material. What kind of image are you getting of Muhammad when you look at all this material? I know you're going to be bringing this in your next book. We had a little discussion a little before this program that you're going to be coming out with a new book and you're going to start moving into a lot of these areas. As you look at this, what kind of Muhammad are you seeing? Where is he from? Who is he? What kind of Arabic would he have spoken if he was? Now, again, I'm assuming that there is a person, but this, maybe don't even call him a man. This, what do we want to call him? A paradigm of an individual, or a polyglot of an individual?
I mean, there are a lot of indications that a lot of the Sirah, the biographical literature, is based on Moses and other biblical figures and extra biblical figures. it was created as a paradigm, Muhammad. And I do actually have, and did Muhammad exist? Some material about Mecca not existing, and the fact that it's very important, crucial, you could say, that Mecca be understood as a center for trade. This is very important for the story of Muhammad, because Muhammad is supposed to have been a merchant. Khadija, his first wife, is supposed to have been the owner of a business that would require him to be traveling into Syria on various sales calls. And the Arabs themselves came to Mecca, not just for the pilgrimage to the Kaaba, but for trading purposes. And yet we have records of the itineraries of various tradesmen, itinerant merchants, who kept records for their own use, not for publication, but very simply so that they would know where they sold something and where they might be likely to sell something again in the future. And they give their itineraries as they traveled down from Europe into India and back. And they would have had to go cross trackless desert waste to get to Mecca, when if they were just going straight from Constantinople across Syria into India, then there's no need to go into Arabia at all. And there's no indication that they did. There's no sign that these people ever stopped off in Mecca, who would be exactly the people you would expect would stop off in Mecca if it were as it were described in the Sirah. So the point is, there doesn't seem to have been a Mecca, at least as a trade route, and Muhammad was retrojected there so that he would be an Arabian prophet, because there are so many indications that Islam was invented elsewhere, not in Arabia, but was intended to unite an Arab empire. And so consequently, the great prophet, who was going to be its founding figure, had to be an Arab. And so they gave him a home in Arabia that just doesn't have any historical existence until he comes along.
Okay, let's go with that. Segue from that into the very next question, and that is, we then move to 690, 691, 692. Al-Malik's in power. He's living way up in Damascus, and he builds this large structure, the Dome of the Rock, right there, smack dab in the middle of Jerusalem, looking down over the Church of the Sepulchre, sitting above it, facing towards Petra. It's on in that building, on the inner ambulatories, the only part that's still original, that's still original today, where we then come across this reference to Muhammad. So it looks like it is this al-Malik who introduces him. Am I correct?
Yes, absolutely. I think there's a great deal of evidence that al-Malik and his lieutenant, Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, invented Islam. They are not the sole authors of it, but they are the first to propagate far and wide the idea that there was a new prophet and a new religion, and that this was the religion of their new empire. In those days, there were no constitutions or parliaments, and what unified the various empires of the day, the Byzantine, the Persian, and so on, was religion. And so the Arabs conquered this huge expanse of territory. They needed a new religion to unify it. And they developed Islam as a result. There are all sorts of indications of this. One of the, sorry, I don't want to go on too long.
No, go ahead. Finish what you were saying there.
Well, there's so many strange things. And this is some of the most wonderful things in Islamic tradition, if you enjoy this sort of thing, as I do. So many strange elements when it comes to al-Malik and Hajjaj. For example, there is, and remember, these are traditions that are transmitted by Muslims themselves. These are part of Islamic tradition. And there's one story where an old man says, we never used to recite the Quran in the mosques until the time of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. Well, now, of course, the recitation of the Quran is absolutely central to worship in the mosques. And it's extraordinary to think that there was no worship, was no recitation of the Quran in the mosques, but it suggests Well, maybe there wasn't a Quran until Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. And the most extraordinary story about al-Malik, where he says, I'm afraid I'm going to die during Ramadan because I was born during Ramadan, I became caliph during Ramadan, and I transmitted, what does he say? Oh my goodness, I'm blanking out. I codified the Quran during Ramadan. Now, that's extraordinary because Abd-al-Malik was the caliph from 685 to 705. And according to the traditional stories, it was the Caliph Uthman in 653 who codified the Quran, who collected all the manuscripts and made a unified text and burnt all the variants. If that were so, however, then it's extraordinary that there's nobody referring to the Quran or quoting it for another 50 years. And then even stranger that Abd-al-Malik would say so many years later that he put the Quran together. Unless maybe he did, and then he claimed it to be the work of Uthman to give it authenticity and antiquity.
Okay, so we have here on the Dome of the Rock, we have these inscriptions. And you point this out in your book, that these inscriptions come from chapter 4, verse 171 of the Quran, though they're not the exact same that we have in the Quran today. They come from Surah 112. And as we look at these different inscriptions, and you've got it all written up there, there's one that I will quibble with. I think the lady that you quoted got one wrong. She referred to Surah 19, Ayah 33, and she says that if this is done in a third person plural, it should be a third person singular because that's what 33 says. She's not got that right. That's actually verse 15 of Surah 19, which is about Yahya. So that's even more disturbing. Why is it referring to Yahya when it should be referring to Surah 19, Ayah 33? Nonetheless, as you look at these inscriptions, they all seem to be attacking Jesus. You brought that out. Why? When he then introduces him, he introduces him there on the Dome of the Rock. He introduces them on the coins the same year, and then he introduces them on the protocols, the caliphal protocols, in his own official documents. And he does that overnight, according to Dr. Yehuda Nevo.
Yeah, it's very strange. You have the inscription on the Dome of the Rock says, "There's no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger," which is the first existing quotation of the Shahada, the Islamic profession of faith. But then it goes on to speak about Jesus for the rest of the inscription. And as you noted, whether that particular reference is correct or not, there's a number of references from the Quran in the inscription, and they're all mixed up. And so what we have to believe is that somebody had the Quran and was flipping pages around and finding the references that they wanted and then putting them together in the Dome of the Rock inscription. It's actually much more likely that the Dome of the Rock inscription predates the Quran and it's one of its sources, such that all the material, or actually almost all the material, in the Dome of the Rock inscription is incorporated into the Quran. But the Quran did not exist as such at that time. Also, because all the rest of the inscription is about Jesus, after that first sentence that refers to Muhammad, in light of what we were discussing earlier, it is also quite possible that that first sentence does not refer to Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, at all, but that the Shahada originated as a polemic against the Christians. The Christians.
I go one step further from that, Robert. If you look at the Shahada that's there on the Dome of the Rock, it has another tag to it. It says, "There is no God but God, and he has no associates." That's not part of the Shahada anymore. What is he has no associates if it's not an attack against Jesus as the associate of God? So that isn't even a polemic against Jesus. When you Surah 112, he begetteth nor is he begotten. Who is that attacking? That's the fatherhood of God, and that's the sonship of Jesus Christ. And that is where they then introduce Muhammad as the alternative to this God of the Byzantines, God of the Christian Byzantine world, which would be their greatest adversary at that point.
Precisely. And so you also have I should say that we should note at this point, in case anybody is confused, that this all means that when it says, "and Muhammad is his messenger," that they're saying that Jesus is only the messenger of Allah, that the praised one is not the Son of God, is not the only begotten of the Father, but is only a messenger from Allah. And that consequently the whole thing is a polemic against Christianity, which also coalesces with the fact that the whole thing is laid out like a Byzantine church.
Hmm.
The architecture of it is taken exactly 100% from the Byzantine churches, even as they're still built today, with the dome and the other features indicating that the building either was a church or a chapel, or that it was designed to compete with churches and chapels and to represent itself as being the same sort of thing.
I would suggest also, and this has always come up in conversation, if it's the biggest structure of its day, it's the most beautiful building of its day, why was it not built in Damascus where he lives? Why was it not built in Mecca if that was a sanctuary? Why is it built in Jerusalem of all places? Unless, of course, it's a one-upmanship against the Church of the Sepulchre, which is down in the valley, down below it. And it's a one-upmanship not only against the church, which is their sanctuary, but is also a one-upmanship against the whole divinity of Jesus, the Trinity. It's against the Trinity in 4:171. It's against the fatherhood and sonship of Jesus in chapter 1, Surah 112. All of these are there attacking really the four cardinal principles, doctrines of Christianity.
Yes.
What better place to do it than in Jerusalem? So that would suggest to me that this is a polemic.
No doubt about it. And also, in this connection, it's important to note that that is a constant of Islamic history, and that in my book, The History of Jihad, I've got literally hundreds of examples of Muslims destroying churches, synagogues, or Hindu temples, or appropriating them for their own use and making them into mosques, or building mosques over their ruins. And that this is an explicit avowal of supremacy and victory, that the Dome of the Rock shows the victory of Islam over Christianity and over Judaism, for that matter. And just in the same way, the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus, which was the Church of St. John the Baptist, shows also the victory of Christianity. The many destroyed Hindu temples with the mosques built over them shows the victory of Islam over Hinduism, and so on. It's always a constant declaration of supremacy throughout Islamic history. And then in that context, to look at the Dome of the Rock inscription as a rebuke of Orthodox Christianity makes perfect sense, because that's exactly what the building was built in order to be.
All right. Now, let's ask this question. Why then did al-Malik need to create this Muhammad? Why did he need to introduce him at this time, 691, 692? Why did he need to introduce him on the Dome of the Rock, on the coins, and on the protocols? What would be your reasoning? I know what you're going to answer, but I think others need to hear this.
Well, actually, I said a bit of it before, that the Arabs had an empire. They had, by the time of al-Malik, an empire of incredible expanse, going across North Africa into the Middle East, all the way into Persia and India. And this empire was going to inevitably dissolve into various warring groups, just like the empire of Alexander the Great, unless it had a unifying principle. And that unifying principle, al-Malik chose as this new religion. And he invested the new religion with qualities of aggression and conquest, with the idea that that the supreme God would reward those who fought on his behalf. It's just the kind of religion, in other words, that you would expect a career soldier and an emperor to create, because he wanted to, his primary goal was to unify and defend and expand his empire. And so he constructed a theology that would aid in all of those endeavors.
Okay. So he has now introduced this man. This is now his prophet. Why would he use Muhammad? I mean, for up to this point, we don't really have we don't really know who this man. Why would he have chosen this man, and why would he chosen that name? Unless, of course, it's the praised one, and this is still reporting to Jesus at some point. Because by the time you get to 696, when he then really takes off his own image and puts the all you have is script on the coins at that time, then you see much more. You see a lot more elaboration of this person named Muhammad. Why would you think he needed to choose this man? Why did he choose himself?
Why didn't he make himself the prophet? Well,
Or
maybe because he was so obviously not one. It's a lot easier to create a prophet that nobody's seen and that you just hear about, and then you can make him the repository of anything you want. Whereas if you're anointing yourself, then you have to pull off the act for those around you, which is considerably more difficult. It seems that what he chose to do was to take a number of existing traditions, including the name Muhammad, the title Muhammad itself, and assign it to this figure. And probably there were, as I said before, there were probably historical figures who may have done some of the things that are now attributed to Muhammad. There may have been somebody named Muhammad. So the material was ready at hand for him to use. And he was able to take it and combine it and use it to and let it coalesce around this new figure that he had created. Muhammad quickly became, as a result of the fact that these existing materials were being used, Muhammad became a repository for all kinds of pre-existing Arabic traditions and non-Arabic traditions, for that matter, which is one reason why the Hadith literature is so full of contradictions. Because after this process was set in motion, then various factions among the new community that were vying for supremacy against the others were able to invent or appropriate existing traditions and attribute them to this new prophet. So that he's praising the destruction of non-Muslim civilians on the one hand and forbidding it on the other. He's saying that alcohol has some benefit on the one hand and then saying it's from Satan on the other. All these contradictions come from warring factions within the Islamic community, putting into the mouth of their new prophet what they wanted to have people believe. And it would seem that the most likely understanding of that, the most likely explanation for that, is that al-Malik started this process by fashioning his prophet out of existing material.
Okay, now we've got the man. You've introduced the man, and he's the one which is going to be clothed this religion. Of course, the first thing needs to happen is a prophet has to have a revelation. All prophets have revelation. So the revelation needs to be put together. And as we can see, it's been put together rather hurriedly, borrowing from many different sources. And that stands to reason then why we have so few manuscripts, or any manuscripts, until really the 8th century. And when we look at those manuscripts, they don't agree with each other. They're not complete, and they don't agree with the Quran we have today. So you've got the book, you've got the man by the 8th century. Once you got the book of the man, you're going to have to give him some story. You're going to have to give him some background. You're going to have to give him some history. That then suggests to me why you have someone like Ibn Ishaq starts to put together the story itself. Obviously, there's an awful lot in that story that's embarrassing, and that's why Ibn Hisham only retains that which he accepts. When we get to al-Bukhari with the sayings, we get 600,000 of these sayings. 600,000, and he whittles them down all the way down to 7,397. So we're talking about really 1 to 2% that he retains. 98% he throws away. And the 2% or 1 or 2% that we have today, the 9 volumes that we have today, I'm sure you've got them in your library there. When you look at them, this is the Muhammad that finally is created in the 9th and 10th century that you talked about at the very beginning of this show. This Muhammad, though, when you look at that, there's an awful lot of embarrassing stories. Things that, why in the world would they retain these stories of him being poisoned, and these stories of him being delirious, and these stories of him having these problems with women, especially his wife, and the story of Zainab. These are embarrassing, even for somebody. Certainly, I know your response would be, well, this is embarrassing for us in the 21st century. These would be embarrassing for even someone in the 8th and 9th century. Why would they introduce these kind of stories unless actually there was some truth to this character, this man, Muhammad?
Yeah, I think that you don't have to posit that there was some truth to the character Muhammad. You only need to posit that the character Muhammad was fashioned from various different sources, and then the contradictions had to be resolved. And sometimes that made them have to invent a story that was embarrassing on some levels. The story you mentioned, Zainab, that's a prime example of this. The story in Islamic tradition, for those who may not know, is that she was the wife rather, of his adopted son, Zayd, and that Muhammad came to visit one day when Zayd was not at home. Zainab, seeing her father-in-law, opened the door without being fully dressed. Muhammad was overcome by her beauty and hurried away. Zayd, who was not a happily married man, then offered to divorce her. And Muhammad said, "Keep your wife and fear Allah." Whereupon Allah gave him a revelation saying, "Why are you refusing what Allah wants to give you and marrying him to Zainab?" So this, of course, has been a source of scandal. And people say he must have been a lecherous old man who lusted after his daughter-in-law and ultimately married her. But what's telling about the story is that in the Quran, chapter 33, where there's very, very gnomic, brief, elliptical mention of it, and it concludes with verse 40, which says, "Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, rather he is the seal of the prophets."
Mm-hmm.
Now, it does seem as if there were probably traditions of the prophet having an adopted son, but that those became inconvenient when it became necessary for the community to rule out any new prophets arising. And so the idea was constructed that Muhammad did have an adopted son, but that he repudiated the adopted son under Allah's command, which is in chapter 33, verse 4 of the Quran, and did so because Allah was ordering him to do so, so that he could marry without sin the daughter-in-law, the former daughter-in-law.
Mm-hmm.
And that this whole tradition was created because the stories of Muhammad's adopted son existed, but had now become, I should also note that in the Islamic scheme of things, and according to several hadith, all the prophets are related. They're all of one family. Muhammad says this. And consequently, if Muhammad has an adopted son, his son is also a prophet. And his grandson will be a prophet. Also, the Shia say that the imam of the Muslim community, the leader of the Muslim community, has to be a member of Muhammad's household and will have something of his prophetic spirit. So the Sunnis, to counter this and to make sure that all prophetic claims after Muhammad are ruled out a priori, they create this story to show that Muhammad has no son. Therefore, he's the seal of the prophets. Otherwise, it would be a complete non sequitur. Okay, so Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, chapter 33, verse 40 says, and he's the seal of the prophets. Why would it follow that he's the seal of the prophets just because he's not the father of any of your men? Unless you're positing that his son, whether adopted or natural, would be a prophet himself, and therefore he must not have any son. And therefore, the traditions that have arisen about his having a son have to be explained away by creating this fantastic story about his essentially stealing his son-in-law's wife at the command of Allah, who then dissolves the process of adoption and forbids it forever after.
You brought this all up, I know, and I remember in your debate with David Wood. I thought it was a very good response. It's difficult, I think, for an awful lot of people who go back and when they look at and I know this is a debate that we've been having within our within Fander Films with a lot of the people who are watching. They want to hold on to the traditional account of Muhammad, these difficulties with Zainab, the difficulties with him being poisoned, and because it's easier to argue that position. It's easier to argue the difficulties with his morality than it is to argue the historical material. How would you counter that? Because I can understand the attraction of the moral argument. I can understand the theological difficulties, the internal contradictions that you have within this person named Muhammad, and certainly his relevancy. The whole issue of relevancy: is he a relevant person? Is he a relevant paradigm or model for today? That's an easier argument to argue because you don't have to know much, you don't have to learn much, you don't have to know names, dates, places, and events. The historical argument, which you're arguing for in this book here, and very effectively. And you've done a great job today of really supporting and giving us a scenario that makes sense. The historical argument, nonetheless, requires an awful lot of footwork. It requires an awful lot of knowledge. Requires an awful lot of memorization of places and events, names, and dates. How would you answer somebody as to which is the more efficacious, or is one better than the other?
In this case, I'm a firm believer in the adage that one can indeed have one's cake and eat it too. Just like I was explaining earlier, that the truth about Muhammad and did Muhammad exist do not contradict one another. So in this case, actually, this is an illustration of how they don't. Because in this case, you can argue that there's a moral problem with the story of Zaynab because it's in the Quran. It's only elliptically explained in chapter 33, verse 37. The details come entirely from the Sirah and Hadith literature. But nonetheless, these things are generally taken for granted as authentic among Muslims. And they can't deny that the story happened altogether as an element of Muhammad's life. You understand, I'm not saying happened in a historical sense, but I mean that it is a part of the story of Muhammad according to the Islamic sources. They can't deny that because it's in the Quran itself. And so you can raise the moral issue there, that how can you have a prophet who you believe was overcome by lust and then ends up marrying at the command of Allah his former daughter-in-law? There are moral problems with that. But and I think they still exist because Muslims believe these things happened. They still exist whether or not Muhammad was a historical figure at all. It's like we can say Macbeth was a bad guy and he wanted to kill Duncan. He did kill Duncan in Shakespeare's play, and he was desperately corrupt and immoral. But that doesn't mean that any of that actually happened. And it's the same thing here. Muslims believe these things, so we need to know what they believe, and we can challenge them on that basis, but that doesn't mean any of them actually happen.
Okay. Really, you're saying both end are needed depending on who's standing in front of you, depending on how they're going to react. If you're finding a Muslim who's saying, nonetheless, I like this man because everything about him is what I want to be. It's everything that he did, I want to do. Everything he said, I want to say. If on that level, then you've got to argue him from within the traditions and say, no, look at how irrelevant it is. This is not the man you want to follow. This is not the things you want to say. These are not the things you want to do. If you do follow this man, look at ISIS, probably the best example of exactly what this man would look like in the 21st century. On the other hand, if this is the man that everything is dependent on, as far as a foundational context, he is the foundation for everything what 1.8 billion people live by, and also the book that he received is the authority for everything they do, say, and act. If that is the case, then historically speaking, you need to then move into that area and say, not only did the man not exist as we know him, neither did the book exist as we know it. And both of these, the foundational start part of it, of the book and the man, are just as false, written by men, created by men. In fact, what you're saying today is Muhammad is nothing more than a man-made creation, started possibly by al-Malik, and then embellished through the next 2 years until we finally get the Muhammad of faith written down by Ibn Hisham and al-Bukhari and others that come after him, al-Tabari and the rest. But the Muhammad of history is a pretty pale person compared to what we see of the Muhammad of faith. On the same token, the Muhammad of faith is still somebody you should not be able to support because of A, B, C, and D and all the difficulties concerning him. And if you want to get a man that is probably the best man for a man of history and the man of faith, why don't you come back to Jesus Christ?
Yeah.
Because not only is he historically accurate, everything that he says and does, we want to follow today. So on both ways, you could take down Muhammad, both historically and as a man of faith, and you could then give as the alternative the person of Jesus Christ, because on both topics, in both categories, he comes out on top.
Absolutely. There you go. That's exactly it. And so there's a place for both lines of inquiry, and they're both valuable in different contexts, and no disagreement between them at all.
So buy both books. These are good books to buy. Start with this one, actually, to get the one of faith, and then end with this one, because this is the one I think, as far as I'm concerned, this is by far the more devastating book. Listen, you've done a great job. I really appreciate the work you do. Robert, it's the first time I've really ever talked to you. I'd like to do some more of these. What I'd like to do is really confront the Quran the next time and other areas. We're going to get some feedback, I'm sure, on this. I understand. I've just been told that actually everything that we're doing has gone private. We haven't gone public yet. So we're going to have to make this public. So from here on, they're going to watch it and they're going to get a lot of comments. I'm sorry about that. I thought this was going public immediately. We hit the private button instead of the public button. It is been recorded, so we will have the recording of this and we'll go out to everybody and then we'll get the reaction from them. Robert, thank you. God bless you. It's good to have you.
You too. Thank you. It's a pleasure. An honor to speak with you.
And it's been an honor to have you. We'll come back again, and we'll make sure that the next time it does go public, because I couldn't figure out why there were no comments coming up here that I could throw over you so people could ask you face to face. God bless you. Until next time, this is Dave and Robert over and out.